So the title of this presentation today is Anti-Racist Mobilization in Europe, Changes and Continuities. Yeah, I would like to start with a couple of preliminary remarks. The first one, do I have the right to address that topic? As you may see, I'm an old white man, so to say, even though it's not the definition I would give myself from myself, but objectively, well, that's what I have. And there are lots of debate about who can really address the issue of racism and anti-racism in contemporary societies. And of course, I do claim that I have the right to address that topic as a social scientist. What I don't have the right to do is to speak on behalf of people who are victims of racism, because personally, I've encountered some behaviors and attitudes that could be connected to racism when I was very young, when Italian immigration was sort of, othered, like people say today. But today in Belgian society and in European society, I cannot pretend that I'm a victim of racism. What I pretend to do is use the tools that I've learned from history, from anthropology, from sociology, from political science to give my account of what is going on in our societies, because I do think that it's our role as social scientists to address the major social, political, and cultural issues that constitute our world, the world in which we live. The second point is another question. Is it possible today to have an academic debate on racism and anti-racism? We all know that social media have taken an incredible importance today, and often the serene and peaceful debates are replaced by fights that can be very hard, where people are sort of delegitimized, are attacked, and polemics often replaces academic debate. And I think that we can, and it is also our role, to try to, we can try with our social science tools to contribute to these debates, but trying to have a real debate, about positions, about point of views, about analysis, without discrediting or aggressing anybody. And I think that these two remarks are important. Probably I would not have made them 15 years ago, but I think that today it is appropriate to raise these points. So what I will do today briefly, it looks like a freestyle exercise, but it isn't actually. I will try to cover a few questions related to recent anti-racist mobilization with a focus on some European countries. I've followed from, as a neighbor, what is going on in Germany, what goes on in France, what goes on in the UK, and of course, what goes on in my own country, Belgium, and my country of origin, Italy, where these issues also are on top now of the political agenda, but also in social, daily life, where racism is very, very strong, and it leads to drama like, for example, last week, the suicide of a young football player from Ethiopian descent who wrote this letter, a young guy, 20 years old, Black Italian person, saying that he could not cope anymore with racism and that he was ashamed to be Black, and the best solution for him was to leave this world. I think this might be just anecdotal, but for me, it reveals social trends that are shaping our societies, and not only not only the political sphere, but also the social fabric of our society. So I will try to address briefly 4 questions. The first one is a comparison between older and more recent forms of anti-racist mobilizations and movements. The second is a question, are we really witnessing a globalization of a new anti-racist movement? The third one is about the leadership, and this connects to my PhD thesis a very long time ago. I wrote my thesis on uh, leadership in immigrant communities, how the communities structure themselves and how they try to mobilize to claim rights or to put other, for example, cultural claims on the public agenda. But here, the question is, are we really witnessing a kind of structuration of an anti-racist leadership in Europe? And fourth, what can we expect for the coming months and years? I'm comparing what I call the older anti-racist mobilization is connected to the 70s and the 80s. Actually, it's when I was myself a student, and I compare that to the past 10 years. And the first thing to say is that we have to resist the fallacious temptation of homogenization. To look at the 70s or the 80s or even the 60s, if you take the United States, as a unique, homogeneous anti-racism civil rights movement. And today, the same risk is there. What goes on, even if we take Black Lives Matter, should not be seen as an homogeneous movement. There are all sorts of lines of fragmentation in the current anti-racist movements, as they were in the 70s and the 80s in the anti-racist mobilization of the time. So let's resist homogenization of anti-racism mobilization and movements. The contexts are very different. In the 70s and the 80s, in some European countries, there was a rise of the far right, but it was sort of marginal. Whereas today, there are all these debates about what some people say mainstreamization of right-wing ideas and policies. There is a very interesting book that was published earlier this year in France by a guy called Philippe Corcuff. And the title of the book is Why Has the Far Right Already Won? And what he says is that there is a kind of ideological confusion today that plays to the advantage of the far right. When you have people like Macron and some of his ministers that actually incorporate in mainstream politics some elements that 10 years ago would have been characteristics of the far right, he says that this reveals a kind of mainstreamization of right-wing ideas and policies. And of course, this is variable from one country to another. What is also different between then and now is the ideologies and theories that were mobilized. Then 70s, 80s, Marxist thought was still very much in the core of the debates. There were the first attempts to combine race and class in the analysis. For example, in the London journal Race and Class, that was led by Sivanandan, an Indian British scholar. There was this idea to use the race grid and the class grid to explain the processes of exploitation, domination that were at work in British society. Well, today, it's fair to say that the Marxist lens are not that much to the center of the debate anymore. There's been the growth of new form of thinking, stressing the importance of race and race as a concept, and we all know how problematic it was to even use the word in some countries for different reasons. But now there is, with the growth of critical race theories and so on, um, that grid of analysis has been, I would say, if not central, has been very important, as is now the perspective stressing intersectionality, race, gender, class, how they connect, how they intersect to create new forms of exclusion, oppression, domination, whatsoever. But sometimes I think that capitalism and neoliberalism remain largely unchallenged. If you look at the debate about diversity, sometimes it is more about sharing the leading positions than about changing the domination structure characteristic of a capitalist economy. So there are all sorts of important differences between now and then at the theoretical and ideological level. Also, in terms of enemy, in the 70s and the 80s, the enemy was identifiable. It was the far right. It was, I don't know, the National Front or the parties that were identifiable, and they were supposed to be the actors that were propagating and reinforcing racism. And so basically the struggle was analytically quite simple. If you win, if you neutralize the far right, you've won the battle. Now, actually, it's more difficult uh, in the sense that what is questioned is more the racist system, the racist structure that create uh, um, an inferiority in the social fabric for specific groups. And in some of the debates today, even the white liberals are considered to be part of the problem, in the sense that, and that was what absolutely not the case in the 70s and the 80s. Well, today, in some parts of the anti-racist movements, some people say, well, we prefer to deal with the far right because we know what we expect. But with white liberals, it's more difficult because you pretend to fight racism, but actually you benefit from the reproduction of the privilege associated to whiteness. So this is complicated because it will have an impact on the type of alliances that can be made in the anti-racist struggle. The claims are also very different. In the 70s and the 80s, one of the major claims was the recognition as co-citizens. It was the idea of being included in society. I remember the debates in France where the second generation activists were refusing the concept of integration, sorry. They were saying, we are integrated. What we want is to be recognized as French citizens like any other citizen. Well, today, the claims are, I would say, are broader. The idea is to change fundamentally the racial structure and the racial system that is denounced in the theoretical and ideological approaches, and that implies a complete revisitation also of the history of colonialism, for example. We have passed from post-colonialism to decolonialism or decolonization. Actually, we are talking about something which is more broader than just, claiming an inclusion in society. The key actors are also very different. In the 70s and the 80s, the main actors of the anti-racist mobilizations are urban second-generation working class migrants. Typically, it was the second-generation Algerian in France. It was the people from the Caribbean and also from India and Pakistan in the UK. In Belgium, it was Italian Moroccans and Spaniards, second generation, and so on. But all these people had in common an history of working class migration. Today, it seems to me that things are different. The key actors are what I call more post-colonial social and cultural elites. If you look at the people who carry the movement today, I'm talking about European countries, not the US, you find an overrepresentation of people with people who sometimes call themselves Afro-descendants with a very high level of education, sometimes coming from a high social background, but who do not have a position on the labor market that corresponds to the social and cultural capital they have. So the key actors are very different. In terms of alliances, um, then the idea of building a trans-ethnic and trans-racial coalition supported by working class organization was the way to go. You know? The more we stick together, the more we mobilize across ethnic and racial lines, the most we increase the probability to make a change. Today, there are lots of debate in the anti-racist movements. Some people say, well, no, we should organize autonomously black-only movements. Other people say, well, we should build alliances, but we should keep, as black people, our autonomy to define the agenda. And the third position is more an old-style trans-ethnic and trans-racial coalition agenda. And so you have these three positions that also are a line of fragmentation. When we had in June 2020, the huge Black Lives Matter demonstration in Brussels, in the preparation of the demonstration, there were huge conflicts between the organization participating, because some were saying, well, it's only Black Lives Matters, so it's only descendant of African, sub-Sahara Africans that would be entitled to speak. And others were saying, well, I'm sorry, but in Brussels, the victim of racism are second generation Moroccans mainly. And so therefore we will take the floor as well. And so you had all these debates that for a couple of weeks, they sort of threatened even the organization of the demonstration. Eventually they found solution. So it means that the situation is quite complex. Going now to the repertoire of actions, 70s and the 80s, there are, big marches, for example, like the very famous Marche des Beurs in France that started in the banlieue of Lyon. And, the people were walking to Paris and they were stopping on the way. And then, the march was growing and growing until it reached Paris with a huge concert against racism that, was really a very visible moment for France. But there were also physical opposition in the streets. For example, in the 70s, in the UK, well, there are physical encounters between, very common on a daily basis, between anti-racist crowds and far-right activists. And I think that in Germany, there was also this type of very strong street actions that were at the time, happening in many countries. Well, today, sometimes you still find that, but social media and internet campaign have really changed the nature of the mobilization and the intensity and the rapidity also of the mobilization. And we see in many countries the growth of decolonizing campaigns. For example, here in Belgium, in Brussels, the public space is filled with symbols of the colonial era, the statute of the King Leopold II, and everywhere there are statutes. And sometimes, if you don't pay attention, you don't see them. But actually, it's really the public space is filled with that. And so you've had all these movements now to tear down the statutes or to change the meaning, to all discussions about what we should do. Maybe instead of getting rid of Leopold II, we should explain who he was and what he did. So these campaigns are very, very mediatic, of course. All the debate about cancel culture, I'm not sure we should enter this here, but there is something like that, especially in the US. What there is an extreme reactivity. There's a kind, anything that happens leads to a reaction. Like a few weeks ago in Belgium, here in Brussels, they wanted to change the names of the tunnels and some streets and squares in order to respect the diversity. And there was a proposal to give the name of one of the longer tunnel in Brussels to a singer that died recently. She's called Annie Cordy, a very popular, light singer. And actually, some anti-racist activists found in a repertoire a song from the 70s, which was called Chaud Chocolat, Hot Chocolate. And they went to the video and decided that it was a racist song because of the symbolics of the video at the time. So in 3 hours, it was a big thing, in Brussels, but also in Paris, because, of the same language and the mediatic space that is shared between the two countries. And so people started to create a big fuss about something that I don't think was so important in the fight against racism. Extreme reactivity that is reinforced by social media and internet. So are we now really witnessing a globalization of a new anti-racist movement? I think that probably there isn't a temptation to import Black Lives Matter analytical frameworks and frameworks of action in Europe. And it is a question open for debate. Is it the same situation? Or to put it differently, do Black Germans, for example, can really be compared historically, sociologically, politically to African Americans? I know that there are different views on that. And about 20 years ago, there was a German sociologist who, I don't remember whose name I do not remember. His view was that actually the Turkish youngsters in Germany were very much comparable to African Americans. I don't remember who it was anymore. And at the time I thought, whatever the harshness of the Turkish experience in Germany, it seemed to me stretching a bit too far, because as far as I understand, there was no Turkish slavery in Germany. And basically the Turkish experience in Germany was very much comparable to the Italian experience in Belgium. Contingented, migration, labor migration, victim of racism and whatever, but never dehumanized as the people who were enslaved experienced in the United States. And so sometimes this creates tensions. And there are people on this side of the ocean that say, well, what about Black migrants who die at sea every day? And the American Black Lives Matter does not say much about that, about immigrants that die by trying to reach Europe. And this happens on a daily basis. So there's a kind of, willingness to import an analytical framework from a country in which the history is to a certain extent different from the various nationals' histories in Europe. So we have to continue to discuss, do we really, and to what extent are the situation comparable? What also we see now is a kind of commodification of the anti-racist struggle. You would have noticed, like me, that now, you know, everybody supports Black Lives Matters. All the brands, Adidas, Nike, everybody supports Black Lives Matter on this side of Europe. And major corporation have become very anti-racist. And so maybe I'm cynical, but, you know, I wonder sometimes if there are not, you know, also economic calculations behind that. And is it really, you know, beyond the symbolic affirmation of support? Is there really something changing? We are now in the Euro, football Euro, and by the way, I hope that Germany will beat France tonight, but that's another story. Uh, um, you know, the teams that put the knee down, you know, this is okay, but it doesn't mean necessarily that racism in the football world is disappearing. What we see, we are starting a project here in Belgium. We've worked with a football club. We see that really the problems of racism and discrimination in football and sport in this country are really, really important. And sometimes, you know, the communication agencies and the Football Federation, they are just happy to have symbolic campaigns, but not really, they are much slower in taking measures to really address systematically those issues. So I'm not sure we are witnessing really a globalization of a new anti-racist movement. Um, there have been demonstrations in many European countries, in some African countries, in some Asian countries, but it's not yet, I think, a global anti-racist movement that would have a strength comparable in the different countries. So in terms of leadership, and I will slowly reach the end of my talk, we see the emergence of leaders in several European countries. And one of the characteristics is the importance taken by Afro-descendants women. And that I find very interesting, that, and it's true to a certain extent in the US as well, the place of women who are racialized in the leadership of these movements is very important. Of course, it varies from one country to another, and maybe slowly we see an embryonic move towards a European structuration of anti-racist leadership. And here, for example, I refer to the European Parliament, where the floor taken by the Black German member of the European Parliament, whose name I've forgotten now, and the constitution of an anti-racism and diversity intergroup within the European Parliament are, I think, important developments that maybe could help to address seriously the issue of discrimination and racism also in the European institution. So where do we go from there? Of course, like you, I don't have a crystal ball, so I cannot say what will happen with and being certain of it. But I think that all the elements are there for an increase of daily violence in the streets. There were quite serious violences between youngsters and the police in the city of Liège in March 2021. Every day we hear, you know, things happening, and I think we should pay attention to that. Yesterday here, the media reported that a young lady wearing the headscarf was waiting, for somebody near in a parking near the supermarket where she was working. She was insulted and physically aggressed by people just because she was wearing the headscarf. And when she went to the police to file a complaint, the police refused. And this is in a place called Ninove. It's 20 kilometers from Brussels, and uh, the mayor of that city is very close to the Vlaams Belang, which is the Flemish equivalent to alternative for Germany. So this is daily life, and I think things could develop um, in a very worrying way, especially in urban um, settings. Second element, uh, as often there could be processes of co-optation of anti-racist leaders in order to de-radicalize them in a way. You offer position, you offer funding, and you try in that way to control and to neutralize uh, radical leadership. When I talk about radicalization, I do not mean at all, uh, I do not refer to Islam or whatever. Just, if you want stronger people who advocate a stronger strategy, can be sort of neutralized through cooptation in political institution. What I'm sure, though, is that the question of structuration will be important. Without structuration, the continuity is problematic, and also without alliances, marginalization is inevitable. So I will just close down with these two formula, thanking you for your attention.